Part of my interest in all of this is the ubiquity of plastics throughout the world, but that we focus on certain graspable objects. And that because of that, we miss the kind of malleability and the changeable forms that plastic goes through and the long temporality of plastic.
Even if we stopped producing plastic right now, we would still have tons and tons and tons of it around as waste for hundreds, thousands of years. There's lots to be said about how challenging it is to envision these post-plastic utopian scenes. Like, is it even possible to live after plastic?
I keep on coming back to the problem of totality and how easy it is to simply evacuate from the frame the things that you don't want to think about.
Part of our responsibility as humanists is to try and imagine better worlds, other collectivities, other possibilities, other political possibilities. And I think this project and this book actually demonstrates why the humanities are so important.
Hello, everybody. I'm Caren Irr from Brandeis University. I'm so happy to be here for this podcast devoted to our new collection, Life in Plastic, Artistic Responses to Petromodernity, just fresh off the griddle from University of Minnesota Press, and here with some of our contributors. And we're going to hear from each of them about their piece and see what points of connection and kind of general ideas build out of our discussion on the topic of plastics, petromodernity, petrocapitalism, the whole phenomenon of extractive energy economies. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce all three of our speakers, and then we'll go ahead and hear from them, I guess in the order that I'll introduce you, if you don't mind. So our first speaker will be Christopher Breu, who's a professor of English at Illinois State University, and he's written widely on questions of masculinity, sex, materialism, and the body. And his essay in the collection is entitled The Petrochemical Unconscious Destructive Plasticities in Richard Powers' Gain. Our second speaker today is Crystal Bartolovich, who's Associate Professor of English at Syracuse University. And she is currently writing a project titled Hating Utopia Properly. And her essay is titled, for the collection, is titled Refuge of Ignorance, A Prehistory of Plastic. And our third speaker today is Sean Grattan, independent scholar and author of Hope Isn't Stupid, also taking up the utopias theme. And his essay for the collection is titled The Impossible Figure of Oceanic Plastic. Take it away, Chris.
All right. It's really good to be here. Thank you, Caren, for the introduction, and good to see all of you and be here in this podcast. And thank you to University of Minnesota and Maggie Sattler for setting this up. My piece in the collection is it focuses on Richard Powers' late 90s novel. I think it's 99 or 98. I can't remember, but Gain. And the novel is a really interesting novel. Powers is probably most famous now for The Overstory, which he published a couple years ago. And he's really one of our leading novelists who sort of address issues of systematicity, address ecological issues, meditate on capitalism, although it's sometimes hard to pull apart where he comes down on it, among other things. But he at least engages it. Basically, what I argued in the collection was that the novel was really interesting, and this links both to issues that Sean and Crystal talk about in their pieces. It is interesting because it actually meditates on questions of scale and how we address issues of scale when dealing with climate emergency and the ways in which plastics in general and various aspects of the petrol economy actually contribute to climate change and contribute to the global decimation of the world ecology. One of the really interesting things in Gain is that there's this split narration between the story of Laura Bodie, who is a realtor living in a small town in Illinois, actually not that different from the town I live in at all. I'm actually in a town called Normal, Illinois, which really does exist, but believe it or not, I try and be one of the less normal features of it, but you never know. But anyway, it's a story of her getting cancer, probably from insecticide that she used at home, although it's never fully clear. And it's something produced by the company that basically dominates the town, or settled in the town for its headquarters, which was the originally soap company, but it becomes the Clare Chemical Company, and they make all kinds of plastics and all kinds of petrochemical products. And so the book actually splits its narration. And what's interesting is it only at one point does the narration really connect. And there's all these sort of attempts at connection that don't really fully connect. And it sort of suggests the incommensurability of scales when we talk about the large scale destruction of the planet by capitalist and ecocidal forces on the one hand. And then on the other hand, this woman living an everyday life in a small Midwestern town. One half of the narration is the narration of the Clare Company growing from a small Boston firm all the way into a huge multinational that's doing, and it goes through every stage of capitalism, from Taylorism to Fordism to sort of post-Fordist marketing processes, financialization, all of that. And it sort of traces, diversification, all of those things. And it traces the development of the Clare Company, the rise of the Clare Company. It just keeps going forward. Meanwhile, the book shows the kind of human cost with, a very detailed account of Bodhi's death. And it suggests that, in fact, her story is not atypical, it's very typical. And this is part of the ecological costs of what the Clare Company represents. There are only kind of two moments where the two narratives sort of interconnect. One of them is through advertising rhetoric that shows up as sort of interludes between chapters. And you get all these kinds of, rhetoric that we all are bombarded with all the time from television, from radio, and if anything, marketing has just gotten even more intense in the 20 plus years since this book was written. And the other one is a fascinating passage in which there's one of those disposable cameras that gets left in a hospital room and it never gets used, but Powers springs into this kind of lyrical, profound account of the production of this simple disposable object from the materials of 7 different continents, and sort of explains how many different forms of labor produce the plastic in it. Part of what I think the book gets at is Powers demonstrates the ways in which so much of how we interact with plastics and how we interact with the world ecology and the specific ecosystems that we're in is unconscious. And in fact, we can't begin to sort of recognize that those conscious dimensions without doing a really fundamental reorienting of what we perceive. Very much like the ways in which commodity fetishism functions to obscure labor and conditions of the labor that go into that product. Part of what I'm trying to do with this piece is actually start to say, we need to find a way of actually talking about that unconscious. And in the larger project, I'm combining Frederick Jameson's idea of the political unconscious, where there's a political both desire and a set of contradictions that exist in contradiction to representation and put pressures on representation. I'm combining that with N. Catherine Hale's notion of the non-conscious. Part of what Hales argues is a lot of what functions in our electronic devices is not so much an unconscious as a non-conscious. And this comes to the question of non-human agency, which I think is one of the crux of the different papers that we're talking about today. But I think we could talk about the agency or actors is a term that Sean uses nicely, I think, in his piece. We can talk about the action or actors of various non-human entities, including things like code and algorithms, which actually shape our non-conscious in various ways. So that's what I'm working on. I'm also really interested in how we actually start to think about desire, like Jameson does, in relationship to ecological functioning and the building of non-toxic worlds. But I'll stop here and turn it over.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. I really think one of the implicit ideas shared by a lot of our contributions in this volume has to do with that relationship between, petrocapitalism as something that we don't observe directly, and plastic in the form of the commodity that we use every day. And if we want to think about that as you're positing as a relationship of the unconscious, where petrocapitalism is the unconscious of the forms of plastic that we know we're encountering. Of course, there are lots of plastics that we don't know we're encountering, and that's a different kind of problem. Let's hear from Crystal.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. I'm very excited to speak about my project with these other projects that are so closely allied in so many interesting ways. And there are some interesting differences too. I want to affirm, though, Chris's observation about incommensurability of scale, because incommensurability of scale is in many ways what I'm dealing with too, and the debate in theory about totality versus assemblages. And the view in some strong assemblage theory, DeLanda, Latour, that there is no totality, right? That scale simply does not exist and cannot be referred to or referenced as having any kind of agency. Whereas for Marxist scholars, the agency of the totality is key. Even if we can't understand it completely or have complete access to it, as Chris rightly said, it's still imperative for a Marxist understanding to attempt to access it. And one of the famous versions of this is cognitive mapping, Frederick Jameson's cognitive mapping. And that is the attempts we make to access the totality from which that will always be incomplete or inaccessible in its fullness to us, and yet has effects on us that we have to trace. That is what Jameson underscores, that in order to act politically, we have to be able to situate ourselves in totality, however obscurely. So from a Marxist point of view, strong assemblage theory actually makes politics impossible as we understand it. And that is crucial. So Jane Bennett encountering the objects in the gutter, right? And she says, we need to stand back and, form an assemblage with these objects and contemplate them with awe. And I'm like, no, pick them up before they get into the ocean, right? All theories produce ignorance as well as knowledge. And you have to choose carefully, right? If you're going to, focus on totality, you're going to miss a lot of dots, right? And sometimes the dots are crucial. My essay, unlike the others in the collection, takes a long historical view. Many of us refer to Jason Moore's theory of world ecology, and for him, it's crucial that we actually take this long historical view. He argues that the ecological catastrophe we currently inhabit emerges with capitalism in the 14th century, right? 14th, 15th century. And so primitive accumulation is the primitive accumulation of catastrophe. My essay argues that this is exactly what Latour continuously brackets. And I look at his famous example in We've Never Been Modern of his recasting of the Boyle debate and the divide that gets made between politics and science in those 17th century debates over the air pump actually produce the perceived rupture between nature and society that's been catastrophic for us. About the rupture, no disagreement, but what I point out is that he entirely brackets capitalism as having any bearing whatsoever on this divide, and that itself is catastrophic for politics. Do we have to change the mode of production, or can we, as Bennett says, attach ourselves to a different assemblage that might have better effects? I think that both of those modes can seem abstract, and therefore you have to work out in practice exactly what the politics should be, but that you also have to have in mind whether there can be any ecological reparation of the planet and any social justice while capitalist property relations exist. That's the bottom line for me. And I talk in my essay about how when we look at the long history, we can see that already the seeds, right, of this dispute about what counts, right? Would you have to look at the larger structure, or can you actually deal at these more localized assemblage levels and have an effective politics? That's what I'm trying to get out of my piece. It's about those concepts, and it is about the longer history of plastic. And I can actually fill in more gaps about that longer history of plastic as we go along, but I want to give Sean a chance.
I guess this, for me, my piece in the text has been in gestation for a really long time. I think the first version of it I gave as a talk at Penn State in like 2014 or so. And it came from having read Ruth Ozecki's A Tale for a Time Being, and this moment in the book that sort of recurs over and over again about the main character Ruth, one of the main characters, Ruth, trying to sort of grasp the idea of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. She keeps returning to her partner, who kind of mansplains the garbage patch at her a number of times. And so I was thinking a little bit about the difficulty of representations of sort of large scale ecological depredations. So this is going to be part of a book project that I've been working on currently called The Aesthetics of the Fucked. And it's an attempt to kind of think through versions of scale and apocalypse and affect in sort of contemporary literature and art. So we had that on one hand, where the character Ruth couldn't really understand this thing that was actually the sort of like the plot device that made the whole book go forward, but it couldn't stick in her mind. There was this giant thing out in the ocean that was swirling, Fukushima reactor disaster garbage up into Canada. And the other thing was this picture that I kept seeing on the internet of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which was not the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It was a picture of a man canoeing in the Manila Bay Harbor, surrounded by like these giant heaps of garbage, right? And I think it's really interesting. The further away I've gone from that first moment of thinking about the essay, the more prevalent the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is in the discussion of what plastic waste looks like. But the problem hasn't changed insofar as it's still not really telling us what that looks like, because the garbage patch isn't something you can really see for the most part. Most of it is microplastics. So I talk about 4 different people, the poet Evelyn Riley, the photographer and filmmaker Chris Jordan, the British poet Jennifer Cook, and then Ruth Ozecki. And each person tries in different ways to sort of get us as people to think about the large structures of plastic. So for Chris Jordan, right, the most famous set of photographs of his from Messages from the Midway, which is a bunch of dead albatrosses. Their guts have been basically replaced by plastic. Thinking about what that does or doesn't tell us about how plastic circulates, both in terms of humans and animals, right, and various other sort of non-human actors. Because I mean, if you're thinking about what the garbage patch is, it's a non-human actor, and has been described in ways that are very lively. Shredder is my favorite version of this, where it's like you get into the sort of whirl of the gyre and the plastic breaks down, and it's an activity, right? One of the questions that looms over, I think, all of, at least for me, my interest in ecological crises and what I'm describing as aesthetics of the fucked. Rob Nixon's talked about how there's a crisis or a drama deficit in the crisis of climate change. We don't affectively feel what's happening, in part because of the long-term scales, the temporal scales that these things are working at. But also, the other sort of argumentative side of my piece is that what happens when we're trying to think about large-scale ecological crises like this is that the responsibility for that large scale gets placed onto the shoulders of individual people. This is part of a sort of neoliberal subjectivity in which, you're going to be able to fix climate change by just picking up a water bottle. Like, that's great, and you should do that, obviously, but that's going to do very little. And obviously, like, if you're just focusing on that, you're missing out on the ways in which various institutions perpetuate and continue producing plastics. And then there's this kind of like guilt and desire that like we can all do this as individuals, which we can't. So part of my interest here is like, how do we both combine the drama of what's happening right now and what kinds of aesthetic moves might produce a sense of, I think Heather Hauser has a really great term for this, which is infowhelm, without being like overwhelmed by all the information that's on the table. And Jennifer Cook's poem, The Second Hand, is really good about this, because she's talking about trying to like hold the idea of the garbage patch in her head, but then it wakes her up in the middle of the night and she's sort of screams sort of shit, like this is here, and like, but then she's on the internet trying to figure out what else she can do. And there's this weird kind of like, it's obviously not ideology critique, but the way in which one uncovers what plastic is, then sort of says out in the world, like, oh, there's plastic in your tea bags, for instance, then you sort of feel worse and better about that because you've said something. But that, individually isn't going to do very much. So I think part of my interest in all of this is the ubiquity of plastics throughout the world, but that we focus on certain graspable objects. And that because of that, we miss the kind of malleability and the changeable forms that plastic goes through and the long temporality of plastic. So that's kind of where I'm going with this, and thinking about, what kinds of forms of politics might come through if we think about the sort of large scale connectivity. I'm thinking about like what, the sort of circulation of plastic might tell us about the ways that we might work collectively and communally with one another.
Thanks. I really feel like that ubiquity of plastics problem is one that so many people are trying to grapple with in different ways, especially the creepy, the eerie, the ominous ubiquity of plastic that's partially on the interior of meat, like us as meat, but also, meats and things that we eat. I feel like that's a phenomenon we can now recognize, and we continue, as Sean just said, to inform each other about. Did you know that your liver contains large amounts of plastic waste and so on? I feel like we need to be able to name that condition of being. It's not a commodity, right? It's not waste exactly. It's a form of accumulation, but it's not primitive accumulation, right? And it has to do with how we're imbricated into, folded deeply into this world that derives from the needs of a petrocapitalist economy, and not, of some kind of a, economy of thriving or something like that. I don't know if you guys have a way of thinking about that phenomenon.
I was really struck by a quote in Sean's essay from, I think, Hauser, you can tell me, and she observes that, how did it happen that plastic, which is such a durable material, right, became the throwaway culture main object? And I thought that was beautiful. And I also want to stress, as I think my panelists would also, that that's not an accident, right? That did not happen accidentally. Just today, right, in the local paper, there was an article about a new study that was released about ocean waste, and we have to stop producing plastic. The United States should set limits on plastic production. And I'm like, yes, great idea. It's exactly the right scale and so on. Okay, so here was the response of the American Chemistry Council, the group that lobbies for the plastic industry. Okay, here's what they said. This is misguided and would lead to supply chain disruptions, economic and inflationary pressure on already hurt consumers, and worse environmental outcomes, particularly related to climate change. Okay, so on the one hand, right, as all of us would agree, you have to look at everything holistically, right? The first essay in the collection is called Paper or Plastic. Paper is terribly ecologically destructive, right? I mean, it's not like having a paper bag is better than having a plastic bag if we're, not reusing, recycling, and looking at the total production and effects of the circulation, right? So it's not that it's easy, but I was thinking, okay, so here I am at home thinking, in the way that, Sean rightly points out, BP wants us to all think about our carbon footprint, right? So that we will not say that, BP needs to be, stop getting its, millions of dollars of subsidies, right? Which is what they're defending, right? They want to put everything on us, because that is the kinds of subsidies that go to fossil fuels, which is massive. And the fact that, this lobbying group gives millions of dollars to politicians, right? So they will not put those limits on plastic production. And so this great idea, right, that, the production itself needs to be limited is probably not going to occur, or certainly not going to occur at the level that is imagined by the oceanographers who are concerned about, plastic in the ocean, because capitalist interests are going to make sure that politicians are going to hear them. But really, when everything is so slanted, right, to the side of corporate power, making our voices heard is really hard. To me, that's one of the fatal flaws in, a Parliament of Things kind of argument.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple things. One, I'm fascinated, Caren, with what you were talking about in terms of like, how do we theorize the accumulation of plastic in the body? It actually is reminding me of my work on my In Defense of Sex project. One of the things I'm interested in is the ways in which intersex bodies and also racialized bodies were used to actually produce forms of knowledge, both urological knowledge and gynecological knowledge, and that it was a kind of accumulation via the body, which is interesting. And I mean, it's a version of accumulation by dispossession, but it's almost a version of accumulation by prosthesis, or by surgical invasion. In various conditions of non-consent, among other things, but I'm interested in how plastic being in us is it's a mode of transforming bodies into a kind of toxic posthumanism, if you will. It's maybe the waste product of accumulation. I mean, we have to think on a number of scales, but thinking on the scale of the body may be really important, and not just our subjectivities, but actually thinking about how the body intersects with all of this, and collective bodies, because I think Sean's exactly right. We can't solve this on the level of the individual. I mean, that's exactly the way, and Crystal, as you put it, that's exactly the way corporations have been basically writing off their own responsibility by foisting it on us. If we all recycled 100%, it wouldn't put a dent in what we need to really address. One of the things I really appreciated about Sean's piece was that we need to think about how representation functions in this context. How do we think about affect? How do we produce affects that actually get people to react to climate change? But of course, Crystal's right too, that we also are facing huge political obstacles. I would love to still see some of this done on the level of policy. We need state actors too. We can't just do this as a collective. Although, Sean, as you point out, the garbage patches are precisely non-state spaces, and so there's no regulation of them necessarily at all. I've been dealing with the ways in which the concept of plasticity has been one of the ways in which gender has been narrated by people like John Money. And plastic seems to be often a kind of excuse to say that you can mold things into whatever shape you want to mold them into. Plastic is actually a material still. It's this absolutely malleable thing that you can manipulate in anything, except for it doesn't disappear. And it's interesting the ways in which the cultural uses of the concept of plasticity are all about the ability of science to manipulate without resistance. And so I think that's also part of the ideology of the present around plasticity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Chris, I think, well, the two things. One, getting back to the kind of like sense of the importance of both a collective action and the sort of institutional actions. I think Crystal's really right. There's a lot of political forces against the sort of collective voices. And I think one of the really brilliant things about the intro to this book is the ways in which in the sort of pandemic COVID moment, everything became single use. And I don't know if it's the case where everybody else lives. I'm walking down the street and I see masks on the ground constantly, or on the beach. I'm about a 45-minute walk from the ocean. So you see them like around there all the time. And coming from a state was a very early adopter of multi-use bags and things like that like immediately that disappears. If you think about like the speed that could happen, that we could go that direction, and that plastic becomes this clean thing when it is, as Caren rightly points out in the introduction, that actually the virus holds on to plastic easier than it did with cloth and other materials. But if we could just reverse that would be great, right? But like have the speed of like being like, oh no, we can't use plastic, would be one of the sort of utopian options here. But that's obviously not on the table in the same way. Then thinking about the sort of utopian element that Chris was talking about in terms of plastics, a number of the essays are thinking about like the way that the Bakelite stuff appears in a couple essays. It's like there's this wondrous material that can do anything. And the sort of like way in which we theorize the idea of plasticity, wanting to be malleable, wanting to like shift and change, how it's seeped into our discourse, plastic has, much like it's seeped into our bodies, might be an interesting thing to think about in terms of the way that we're sort of approaching some of this stuff.
Yeah. Do we think in a plastic mode? I do want to say, I think there's some potential for understanding and developing a kind of rhetoric of crisis around plastic as a public health problem. The other piece of the pandemic, of course, that we see in addition to the waste is, the ability to transform all kinds of social institutions on a dime. right? The way you work, the way you go to school, the way you shop, all kinds of production and so on. It can change very rapidly when public health is the risk. That's, I think, a whole different set of terms and way of reacting and just understanding of our collective entanglement with each other. I mean, obviously they need to be entangled, and you can't address the public health crisis while continuing to crank out masses and masses of this stuff. But it is the fact that even if we stopped producing plastic right now and no more entered our environment, we would still have tons and tons and tons of it around as waste for hundreds, thousands of years to deal with. And it's as it degrades, those health issues continue. And some of the poets actually that Margaret Ronda talks about in her piece really have interesting ways of imagining that. Adam Dickinson, in his book Anatomic, is like registering the changes to his endocrine system that happens, as he's encountering different petrochemicals, and like measuring what's part of his interior, what's happening in it to his own chemistry as he lives in a kind of poisoned environment. And that's a kind of living with your own horror that I don't think very many people could sustain. But maybe a dose of that kind of horror is politically powerful.
I'm really glad we're talking about public health. I too, like Sean, was really struck by that really great way that you started the introduction, bringing in this massive increase in plastic waste. But it also led me to think about the flip side, being a dialectical thinker, of the kinds of plus to public health measures that you're discussing. On the other hand, there is, of course, all of the people who refuse to get vaccinated, wear masks. And that's an issue of, quote unquote, individual rights, to go back to the problem of the individual that Sean was talking about, and a wanting to ignore the collective good, right? I mean, and it's really important that we remember how powerfully that is invested into American politics, right? As I heard a senator say yesterday, the people have a right to be wrong. Seriously? And he was specifically talking about not being vaccinated, right? I mean, that everybody has a right not to be right. And I'm thinking, not if it's going to impact on everybody and everything else, right? How does that get written out of the script? I keep on coming back to the problem of totality and how easy it is to simply evacuate, right, from the frame, the things that you don't want to think about. I am worried about what will happen to me if I get this vaccine. What about the 2-year-old of, your next door neighbor who can't get vaccinated, right? And that you could help perpetuate some terrible variant that is going to, infect. I want us to remember also the flip side, because I totally agree, that the public health framing is really interesting, but it's really interesting how it works on both, as a positive and a negative.
I agree, Crystal, that we're up against certain kinds of individualist thinking and a kind of almost joy in not taking responsibility for what one puts out in the world. Whether it's anger, whether it's trash, whether it's violence. When we start thinking about totality, I think the other thing that we have to think about is how much of a global issue this is. The US, for its population, produces way more waste than any other country. And yet we are not the people who actually wind up dealing with its effects for the most part. That image of the Manila Harbor, right, captures it, that most of our waste goes to other countries and other countries get paid off to deal with the waste. The question of scale becomes a question outside of national borders. How do you produce alliances that actually transcend national boundaries? I have a former grad student who is my favorite grad student of all time, PhD student, Erica Wills, a labor educator and activist, as well as a professor of labor studies. For her, so much activism turns on the transnational, linking by the sort of chain of production rather than by national contexts or by labor labels. Instead, the idea is to link all the laborers, whether they're skilled or not. That's the kind of organizing I think we need to think about.
So yes, I mean, I think one of the crucial things is to think about this as a transnational issue. Borders aren't really a thing, right? I mean, they are, but like in terms of the ways in which climate change happens, like borders don't matter. But the borders do matter insofar as certain national entities produce way more waste. And we all know this, but the US produces way more waste than any other place. And we, as Chris rightly says, like we don't necessarily deal with it in the same ways that other places do. So there's uneven development of apocalypse happening here, right? I think one thing that we're leaving out of this, and I was struck by this in terms of talking about the flip side of public health and the sort of kind of like, these are my individual rights, is desire and the kind of concept of desire, both in consumption, but also in flouting your consumption. I'm thinking about those trucks when you like put the sort of semi like exhaust pipes on the back of your like pickup truck, and the joy or response that people get out of driving by like someone in a Prius, you know, exhaling a bunch of gas. There's something really important to think about the ways in which like, and what is it ideologically that's, I mean, it's this kind of like ideological individualism, but not for a sense that I'm an individual that can be part of the common good, but I'm an individual that gets to assert my individuality over other people, people I don't agree with, and people who I think that like are, you know, namby-pamby, woke social justice warriors or whatever. And all of this like is obviously nonsense, but it's nonsense that people feel very deeply. Something I think we have to grapple with in very real ways in terms of thinking about how we identify as consumers and what we identify as consuming, right? And excessive consumption, you know, is I think in some ways a very American sense of being in the world, right? You know, and identifying with products and identifying with actually the deadliness of those products is worth keeping on the table here.
Just a quick response to that. You know, maybe we can actually articulate forms of utopian or positive desire for like a drinkable water, for environmental surround that doesn't immediately poison you, that we could actually have collective desires for a rich and redeeming world. I mean, and the we here is very complicated. For the world that many of us thought we were sort of vaguely living in while we were destroying it in various ways. Maybe we can think about a different version of that isn't built on toxic violence and destruction. Do you want a livable environment? Are you happy to live underground all the time and with masks, you know, and not just because, you know, governments are telling you have to wear masks, because you won't be able to breathe otherwise. On the other hand, I also think that one of the things we don't think about, and I think you got it exactly right, Sean, when we talk about those people who, you know, are driving their trucks with glee past the Prius, that part of this is also a kind of complicated resentment that takes on class characteristics. You know, part of the divide during the pandemic was between those of us who could actually stay at home and work and those who actually were working because they were essential workers, which meant they were paid like shit and treated as disposable, who actually had to work out in the world. And there's the feeling like, well, I'm not safe. Why should you be safe?
Yeah, I think that those class issues are crucial, and it can be super complicated. I mean, I'm from Southern Ohio, right? Appalachian Ohio. My grandfather was a coal miner. I have grown up with the discourse of, you know, King Coal and the importance of the fossil fuel industry and protecting it. There's a really, really firm, but like for all of us with different things, to believe, I mean, not to say had to put myself at risk, you know, you should be at risk too, but to believe that there isn't any risk. You know, I've spent my whole life in the coal mine and I'm fine. There's a really strong sense that, you know, we lie, right? If you're trying to make an environmental case, but you know, to go back to the desire, it's very difficult. I know from my own experience, and you know, I've been reading lots of books where people try, right? I mean, I've just been reading Wasase and Leanne Simpson, University of Minnesota Press author, you know, writing about how difficult it can be to get people to join political struggles, right? I mean, there is nobody on this call who has not experienced it themselves, right? And about any number of issues, it's really hard to get people to participate in collective political acts. One has to think about what is making the shift, even when you know, right? I'm talking about people who know that, you know, global warming exists and is bad. how do we shift, right? I think that this is something that all three of our essays share. And in fact, that I think the volume shares in general. How do we shift from a certain kind of knowing and even feeling to effective politics? And that's the hard thing. So I think that we kind of did in this book, really great work on different images or texts that can help people think these really complicated issues through, as teachers are likely to do, right? But that next step is the hard one, right? How do we translate that or help participate in? I guess that's the only way it can be properly put. Going from that desire to movement, because it certainly does not happen spontaneously.
Yeah, I think that's a good thread to draw the pieces together and part of the conversation that we've been having. What are the tasks that relate to plastic now that are important to accomplish? And clearly a major one that a lot of different people have been taking up, especially in the visual arts, interestingly, is just making plastic waste visible. And that often involves projects that accumulate, lots and lots of instances that are, they have accretion and numerousness, as their theme to build up those questions about scale. So just making waste that we extrude from our immediate environments visible, and reminding ourselves collectively of the fact that matter doesn't disappear, right? That of conservation of matter, as a fundamental principle is crucial. But for narrative arts, for writing, I think we have different kinds of options, different kinds of tasks that become present. From Chris's essay that makes the links, between something like individual experience to kind of corporate presence, or Crystal's that helps us see the long evolution and prehistories of things that we might take for granted in the present, to Sean's that expands the geographic scale and multiplies our perspectives, on something that we might think we already know, like it sounds like there's a place you can go and visit the patch, but maybe it's not, and kind of gives us a different way of thinking about space. Like we have all of these problems that are specific maybe to plastic and some of the other new forms of waste and new materials of the 20th century. We have these problems of visibility and interconnectedness. We need to know where they are as dots in the totality, or as as strings, as spaces there. And a lot of these arts are using their particular capacities to achieve that issue of visibility. That definitely doesn't solve the question of what comes next, but it's important. I think there's lots to be said about how challenging it is to envision these post-plastic utopian scenes. Like, is it even possible to live after plastic because it endures so long? Should we in fact be thinking about environments that are managing and are mitigating effects and so on? Do we need to have a different kind of utopian imaginary in order to live with the waste that we've already created? I think of this sometimes as like a really middle-aged way of being utopian. It's like, yeah, you made those decisions, you got to live with them, but it doesn't mean that you have no options, or that everything is foretold. A teenager looks at a middle-aged person and says, your life is over, it's terrible. Just somebody from a completely pristine environment might, from the country, might look at the city or whatever and say, this is a poisoned, damaged place, don't be here. But when you're actually in those spaces, you see there's room to operate, there's space for transformation. And we have to figure out what those spaces and visions of a non-pure but future-oriented environment that includes plastic might be like.
No, I think that's exactly the point. What I'm trying to write towards, and I think I'm really interested in different kinds of moments, which these the fix, people start talking about what kinds of fixes we might have. I'm sure I'm not the person coining this, but like the mycological turn that sort of happened, whereas like mushrooms are everywhere, right? And like, I mean, physically they are everywhere, but they're also like in sort of pop culture, and they are sort of being seen as this fix. But often with the language of like, well, you've really fucked this one up. So, but look, mushrooms, and that's going to make everything better. We don't need to actually do anything different. So that's terrifying, because we obviously need to do a lot of things different, because the mushrooms were there before too. We just didn't really realize it. For all of like the sort of obviously like apocalyptic and disgusting forms of like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, like there are ecosystems that are being built there by various creatures, and that are making this thing that we did work. And this doesn't mean let's keep doing the bad thing, but that, as you were saying earlier, even if we stopped all plastic production, like that, there's no post-plastic, because we're all going to be done living by the time the plastic is done. So we have to think of a living with plastic, and what that looks like.
I want to raise at this point Sylvia Wynter's famous quote that white utopia was a black inferno. As soon as we start talking about the utopian, I think it's really important to, meditate on that for a while, that what can look good, right, to one group can be built on the destruction of many other groups. And historically, that's indeed been the case. In fact, hating utopia properly is precisely about that dilemma. That critique is now really widespread, right? That, utopia is actually really dangerous. And I'm talking about on the left, that utopianism can be really dangerous. Look what it's done historically. There's tons of these critiques. Often, though, the authors do not completely throw away utopia, though, unlike the conservative critics of utopia, who do want to reject it wholesale, that any attempt to make the world better is actually going to make it worse. That's actually one of Latour's arguments against totality, right? That, attempting to have a total transformation is bound to destroy. But that's actually a conservative argument. I mean, it goes all the way back to Burke. And what I'm doing in my book is actually looking at the first 100 years of responses to More's utopia in England. There are hundreds of them. Virtually all of them are negative or ambivalent. And I think that's really telling. I think we have to keep in mind this anti-utopianism as it's self-destructive, and yet also remember that there's a real critique of utopianism to be made at the same time. Dialectical thinking, everybody.
Yeah, I think there's something that you're just mentioning, Thomas More, famously saying that we should make toilets out of gold, so that people change their relationship to gold and don't like fixate on it and so on. That's such a good reminder of the way that materials are so important for utopian thinking, right? That it's, of course, they're predominantly about social organization, but visions of the transformation of our material environment are crucial. You're thinking too of Fourier, isn't it? Fourier, who has like the fountains of lemonade, and these visions of how you're going to change not only your landscape, but what can be in it, and so on. Maybe that's helpful for us for thinking about plastic. I mean, plastic itself is a utopian product about which people respond in a really exuberant way. It's, it's magic, it's transformative, it's going to make everything clean, bright, cheap, and beautiful, even though obviously, it's followed by dystopian, quickly turns into something that's, cheap and disposable and trashy. It has that kind of dialectic of attitudes embedded in it as a material. Drawing on this tradition of thinking about the ways we can revalue and reorganize the matter of our physical worlds in that utopian tradition, I think would be really productive. We have a way of grappling with the problem of plastic that's tied to its already existing shapes, right? Almost, to nurdles, to the plastic glomerates, we're sort of, to these plastic bottles that wash around, like we're sort of struck in dismay and awe at the abundance of shapes that this stuff can take, in its own right. And we're kind of collecting and fascinating ourselves with those things. But going a step further, which is completely reasonable with a synthetic man-made substance, to envision transforming it and the places that it holds in our physical environment. That seems like a site for utopian thinking. And I'm curious what's happening there. And I feel like we've named all kinds of interesting projects for what I'm now envisioning as Volume 2, the politics of plastic. I want to invite you guys, if you have one last point you want to speak about or kind of hit home, to do that, and before we wrap up.
So, yeah, I've just been thinking about the role of the humanities in all of this. And since this is a humanities project, and one of the recent debates internal to the humanities and to literature to a certain degree recently has been the sort of post-critique argument, against critique and sort of appreciating other dimensions of texts. Working off of, but I also think transforming Eve Sedgwick's, her account of paranoid versus reparative reading. And to me, the rejection of critique is wrong for a number of reasons. I think we're demonstrating why critique is necessary. What Crystal is arguing for in terms of the, thinking dialectically and looking at totality, and that representation needs to actually get us to the place where we start to have a recognition and a feeling of what the problem is in terms of, the ecocidal violence that contemporary capitalism and the organization of our life worlds is producing. But the one thing I think the post-critique crowd is right about, although I think this is already always part of Jameson's notion of dialectics, among other things, is part of our responsibility as humanists is to try and imagine better worlds, is to try and imagine how art relates to what Sean was talking about in terms of desire, how it relates to imagining other spaces, other collectivities, other possibilities, other political possibilities. And I think, the humanities is under assault in all sorts of ways right now. And I think this project and this book, with its timeliness and its necessity, actually demonstrates why the humanities are so important.
I totally agree with what Chris just said. And I would throw in summarizing some threads from this conversation. When I thought about the section that Caren put us in, Plastics, Capitalism, which of course was so apt for our 3 essays, I was really struck by, how we think about that. And for me, it's plastic in capitalism, right, as part of capitalism. But there are a number of ways, of course, to read that phrase. I think theorists might read it completely differently. But that's where I want to make my intervention. In the correct and proper desire to critique human hubris and attempts at mastery, too often what's gotten thrown away is human and not equal, right? Uneven responsibility. This is explicitly rejected by Bennett, for example, right? I mean, who argues against responsibility because it allows humans a hierarchy, right, in relationship to things. But of course, if we've created humans damage, then we have a responsibility to repair it. That is a responsibility, not a mastery, a responsibility. And that distinction has got to be made. You can critique mastery, that's correct and proper, but you have to keep responsibility and its terrible unevenness. So when we critique individual behavior, we shouldn't have an individual politics, but at the same time, our lives actually are going to have to change, right? They really are going to have to change in order to repair the earth and have global social justice. It's impossible to imagine how that would not be true. And so I think that attempting to imagine that individuals' lives are not going to be altered in the United States by the demands of ecological repair is not true, and that we just have to suck it up, right? And we should, right? So critique mastery, but maintain responsibility uneven, right? Recognizing that it's uneven.
So the weirdest thing that ever happened for me in terms of publishing a book was the first review I got described me as a post-critique person, and I was surprised because that's not how I would imagine myself. But giving the post-critique crowd a sort of sense that they're the space in which one is right to imagine other kinds of collective forms of like other worlds are possible, I think is maybe ceding too much territory, because certainly one of the key elements to critique, right, is that you're producing a sense of the possibility of thinking otherwise. I think one of the things that's crucial in talking about plastic and climate crisis and climate change and all these things is trying to figure out ways in which we can feel it. It can be affectively engaging, and that's really hard. I come back to all the time this moment, and I can't remember anymore who it was, but on the Senate floor, right, holding a snowball and saying like, it's late spring in DC, and like there's a snowball here, and so therefore global warming doesn't exist, because like, look, it's cold out. This is just centered on that one particular sin acting like an ass. And that like, that doesn't even imagine that like, the way in which like, it's not even spring in a different hemisphere, like, and so I think there's sense that we need to imagine the world affectively otherwise. And how do we get there? Because that's, I think, one of the things that we've been talking about here is like that feeling something is not the same thing as changing the world, but I think it's a crucial step. And so that side of this, I think, is one of the things that connects all of the pieces in this book, some more opaquely than others. And then secondly, that the world does need to change. And that, as Crystal just pointed out, like that means we need to change too. It's not like we can maintain what we're doing and have the world become something other than it is. And I think that one of the things that came out of this conversation that I was really excited about is that like there are some models that exist for rapid change, and to think through what those kinds of like utopia, and that is a utopian possibility. In utopia is a pedagogical mode, right? So this kind of process of moving towards something, if we see a model, like why not fight for it?
Thank you so much.